Next question, which is also, I just skimmed through some of these and they're really good questions. It seems one of your ideas about how to put the natural supernatural split world back together again comes from Peugeot's perspective on powers and principalities, which can be described reductively in that angels, demons, and lesser gods are comparable to Uncle Sam and Santa Claus. That's right. My second conversation with Jonathan Peugeot, we got into this. And because in my first conversation, I was curious about this. And so I eventually began to understand what Peugeot was talking about with respect to Uncle Sam, Santa Claus, these human-made constructs, these these personalities. It's so funny because when Jordan Peterson talks about, was he it was just in the Susan Blackmore thing, which of course I rewatched recently and did a commentary on. And Peterson will often say things like the best way to think about these things are as personalities, and it's like, hmm. And even going down within us, all these little sub personalities, because another question talks about the consciousness Congress coming up later in the questions here. And so I think that for me was a super helpful understanding of person. If you recall my conversation with Nathan Jacobs, that's one of the questions I wanted to hear him talk about, and it's right there in my long conversation with him. What's a person? That's an astoundingly difficult thing to talk about. And actually, um, not only is Rick quiet and behind the scenes, his brother, who is actually far less quiet at the in-person meetups, brought this question because we're wrestling with it with respect to AI. What is a person? We've got the Turing test. And so one of the things that we see is that human beings organize themselves and create constructs like Uncle Sam and Santa Claus. And it is, I think, a fair appropriation of New Testament language with respect to these things. Now, that very much leads up to the second question, which is, which I very much expect and understand given our cultural context. I've heard you describe the powers and principalities surrounding contemporary America as of our own making and out of our control. And I think about this as something like school spirit. Most of us have a very real understanding of how to deal with school spirit or company spirit. We usually don't use that word, but company spirit and school spirit are basically the same thing. School spirit is a vitally important thing. Let's think of your high school. School spirit is vitally important. It's communally constructed. It's pervasive. It's it's ontological in CultureNet and gets expressed physically and shapes physicality. And so that's, I think, if you can understand that, you have you can begin to understand what we mean by this crazy word spiritual that we keep asking about. And so school spirit, I mean, everyone is trying to impact school spirit, and they do. The class president, the principal, the teachers, the jocks, the nerds, the potheads. Those were the main groups that we had in high school when I was growing up. So they're all trying to impact school spirit one way or another, according to where they think it should go. But none of them are really in charge of school spirit. And it's not really something that anyone can sort of take a hold of. So we participate in it, we create it, but it's also, as Jordan Peterson, I think, would help us see, centuries and centuries and centuries old. And that's really important to think about because all of our cultural stuff then goes into it. Okay, now we're getting to the rest of his question, which is an excellent question. Because all of this leads us, especially in our physicalist, materialist space, to a fear, because here is one of the main biases about our culture. We presuppositionally make an a priori assertion that says there are no spiritual beings above or beyond us. That's a bold assertion. It's an assertion that the ancient world simply would laugh at. Many in the world today, particularly in the less developed world or in Africa, simply laugh at it because that you know they think that's the most preposterous idea. But that is, again, we had an idea in the lab back when we were beginning to understand science. It's let's act as if there are no spirits or spiritual forces above or beyond us. That's basically a definition of Charles Taylor's buffered self. Okay. Let's start with that and let's use that in the lab in order to understand how reality works. The problem is sort of like a virus in a outbreak movie that got out of the lab and got into our general culture and has been infecting us. And that happened in the 18th century. And it continues to happen today, but it's passing away with modernity. All right, let me continue with the question. I've heard you describe the powers and principalities surrounding contemporary America as our own making, but not of our control, or something to that effect. For me, this way of talking about unifying the split world seems to strengthen the now decrepit modernism that says there's no split world because there never has been enchantment, right? And that would be how a modernist would read it. But I, on one hand, want us to recognize our spiritual power, which is to create school spirit, which is to create human culture, which is to create Uncle Sam. C.S. Lewis made the point that we are amphibious creatures, but the problem is here in a modernist realm, we don't have enough understanding of what we mean by spiritual to understand the spiritual power that we use. So I completely understand a modernist hears this and says, aha, well, now I have yet another way to debunk spirituality because it's just humanity. And it's like, yeah, but don't forget the dominant bias, the 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 idea that was hatched in the laboratory and escaped out into the general population and has been infecting us for almost 300 years. And it's just a raw assertion that, again, most of human history looks at and says, well, that's dumb. Have you not been paying attention? And it can only be maintained by willful blindness with respect to all sorts of things which we have relegated in our culture to low status, low important areas. Now, in all fairness to the power of that idea, there was a lot of bullshit around about enchantment. And so it's a very powerful idea and a very useful idea that created a degree of discipline amongst human beings. But we forget it's only an idea. We forget it's a act as if and live as if assumption, which is basically Jordan Peterson flips it around and says, okay, let's assume that this idea which broke out of the lab and has now infected everyone in the culture, let's live as if maybe that's not the case. And then that begins again to re-enchant people. Maybe this can also be described as everything being in the system. As I learned from your talks with Sokold, that God being outside the system is pretty important to you. How are you envisioning the Piageotian perspective unifying the split world rather than furthering it? Because it's both and. Because we not only are spiritual beings that have the capacity to create principalities and powers all around us, and we keep doing it. Human beings work that way. And that's why. So on one hand, I want us to have a deeper, richer, fuller understanding that this is reality. And that's a reality that we can fairly easily have access to. But the other reality, which is that what if we are not the only spiritual beings? What if there are spiritual beings that are older, stronger, influential? What if the buffered self is simply a symptom of the virus that got out of the lab? Now suddenly, and that's why, I look at Brett and Heather and listen to the way they're talking and think, oh, And it's C.S. Lewis's comment, if you want to stay an atheist, you got to be really careful about what you read, because that virus that broke out of the lab is regularly defeated by the the other powers and principalities that are out there. Now, again, I really love the school spirit metaphor because I think it helps materialist people connect very commonly and broadly to, okay, what do we mean when we're talking about spirit? And so Peugeot was super helpful for me that way, but it's both and God is outside the system. So uh, and this is the thing. He's both outside the system, and he also invades the system. And that's the thing about the meta divine realm and Christine Hayes's observation that, so if you imagine an impersonal, non-agentic meta divine realm, it's still creating the rules. And so, and again, we're seeing that in Facebook and Google. These are platforms. These platforms are arenas, but in subtle ways, they shape the inside. And so again, the distinction, the agent arena relationship, the distinction of the two is vitally important to help understand the interaction between them. But the line between agent and arena isn't quite as is a little bit more permeable than the idea imagines it to be. Yes, you've understood me correctly, and I think I've just clarified this. P.S. I have found the Peugeotian perspective really helpful, as have I, to imagine meaningful overlapping between the sides of the split world. And so I think there is a world healing potential there. There is. And that in very many ways is the idea behind the woke movement, because the problem with woke is not that societal spirits created by us don't perpetuate injustice. That observation is dead on right. And that observation is, in some ways, kicking the stuffing out of certain places of modernism. But human beings almost always overreach. And part of, and a number of you recommended the Distributists video on New Atheism is Boring, which was a good video. Um, but the wokeness too much assumes homie, as he said, human ontological moral innocence. It's just it's again it's sort of a retreading of Calvinism, as James Lindsay has said, and it's a bad retread. And so if you have experience in Calvinism, you should have some understanding of the way that the system is lying to us all. It's not very different from the Calvinist who says, I'm in touch with my total depravity, and then beginning to imagine themselves an elitist who's no longer susceptible to it. And it's like, no, just knowing you're totally depraved doesn't mean you stop being totally depraved. It's a helpful thing to recognize, but if you really appreciate the depths of your depravity, um, there's potential. And then, so I don't, so the person who's trying to get in touch with their privilege, that's a good thing. Get in touch with your privilege, but understand you will, there are way more privileges than just sex or race. In some ways in our culture, money is the dominant privilege. So it's the problem with that system is that it just doesn't, it's just too simplistic and facile, and it's now been weaponized for cheap political gains. And the cheap political gains, I'm afraid, aren't actually going to help the people that they purport it to help. And I think Brett Weinstein is right that so you run the revolution and say, we're doing this on behalf of the victims and the poor and the underclass and whatever your oppressor group is. And then every time this program is run, it's just a new elite that comes into power. Listen to the Who song, here's the new boss, same as the old boss, because this is how we are. And I think this is It's a cheap imitation of the kenosis of Christ, where he empties himself. But here's the thing: for would-be messiahs, um, you really have to believe in the resurrection if you're going to allow yourself to be placed on a cross. And most of us say, I want to go, I want to run the Christ thing all the way up to the triumphal entry, and then we're going to kick out the Romans and we're going to be in charge and we're going to make the world better. Oh, so you've just forgotten everything that you've said about human beings and our corruption. So that's why the woke thing, well, there's a bunch of legitimacy to it, but uh, the people that I see promoting it, I was over at Kendi's website, and the main picture on his website is him standing up in front of a group, and everybody's there in tuxedos and fine clothing. And yeah, there's a nice pastel of different skin colors, but I dare bet that almost everyone in that room has way more money than almost everyone here um, in this conversation, and that isn't going to end. And so, yeah, paint me cynical about their revolution. So I found the Pajoing perspective really helpful to imagine meaningful overlappings between the sides of the split world. And so I think there is a world healing potential there, but only to a degree. I think by going all in on powers and principalities as man-made, originating, and phenomenological, and again, back to my comment, some of them are man-made and some of them are ontological by us. And it could very well be that in terms of repetition, some of the principalities we are creating are actually very, very ancient. And this is where you get into Jordan Peterson archetypes, because principalities and archetypes are related. They're not identical. The archetypes are more the symbolic, dramatic, and then they become liturgical. But so Santa Claus, the Santa Claus archetype, isn't is probably very ancient. So, but they're not merely man-made. Um, you're risking doing what Michael Heiser critiques God, as God, often as referred to in the Bible, as the same category of the other spiritual beings. Right. I think Michael Heiser's critique is correct. God is not, and that's why God as arena, God's arenic quality is terribly important in this, because that's the uniqueness of God, is the arenic quality. There can only be one arena. And again, C.S. Lewis talks about this a bit in his book Miracles, but he's using different language. Is tantamount to creating, right, and that's why the God as arena and the arenic quality of God is vital for the uniqueness of God, and why God is not like Spider-Man or Zeus or these other things. So it's a great question.